Have you ever looked at the way you store your photos and thought, there's got to be a better way? I recently had an experience with a couple people, and it made me realize how much people can struggle with this process. So in today's video, I thought we'd talk about storage, how to store your photos, specifically the types of devices that you can use. This is going to be a two-part series. In the first part, we're going to talk about things like hard disk drives and solid state drives, and I'm going to offer you some tips to be more efficient and more effective in this process. I'm also going to mention network storing. This is going to be done through a device called a NAS drive. I've recently got my hand on one, and I'm going to mention it in this video, but I thought this topic could be so interesting, I'm going to devote a whole video just to NAS storage, how I'm using it, and some of the upsides for me. But today, it's direct attached storage, and I'll tell you all about it and maybe give you some advice or some tips that are going to help you with your personal storage right after this. Now, if you've been watching the channel for a while, you probably know my style is to keep things very practical. We're going to deal with some technical information in this video, but I'm going to try to make it real simple and make it all make sense. I'll do that through some graphics over here and some illustrations. But really what we want to do is take a fairly technical topic and make it very easy to understand, but more importantly, to help us with both of our storage and efficiency in our process. Now, I also like to tell some backstory, so I'm going to give you two people's stories in this one, and I will not mention their names, but they're probably watching it and they know who they are. I had some clients and we were out on a workshop, and in the process of shooting, we were talking about storing files. And I questioned them a little bit, like, how do you store this and how do you store that? And the answers were a little bit all over the place. And what I came to realize is that one of the photographers essentially, well, they just go out and they buy CF Express cards, rather large ones, up to 1 terabyte at a time. And they just keep filling them up and then putting them into a shelf and grabbing another one and filling that up and putting it on a shelf and filling another one. And I thought, oh my goodness, my head was about to explode. I'm somebody who likes things a little bit more organized so that I can find things and you know, if I need to get a file from a certain date, I can find it pretty easily, or a certain subject. And I realized that this person was essentially just using these cards as their primary storage device. Not all of it, but a good portion of it. And so we talked about that a little bit and some better strategies. Around the same time, I had another client out on a workshop and we had the same type of discussion. And she showed me something like this. And I said, how many of these do you have? And she reluctantly answered, in the double digits. And I said, can you explain how you store your files? And basically they went on a small disk drive like this, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and they went into a basket. And I said, well, how do you know when you shot something or what you shot? I said, please tell me you have everything dated and maybe put a P-Touch label on there and the files inside have dates and names. And she just kind of laughed. And I said, oh my gosh. Now I will tell you, some people enjoy the process of shooting much more than the process of editing and organizing. And these two clients both suffered from that predicament where they loved to shoot. They loved to be out in the wild. They didn't love the idea of figuring out what to do with those files afterwards. So in today's video, I thought, let's deal with some of those very easy concepts. And let's talk about different types of storage. So in this video, we're going to deal with what we would call direct storage or direct attached storage. There are other types of storage. So we're going to mention one in this video called network attached storage, or NAS. And you may have heard that term. I'm going to do a whole video dedicated to that. So this is a two-part series. First one, we're talking more about the direct attached storage, hard drives. Then we're going to talk about NAS, dedicated in another video. I did get my hands on a NAS device from a company called Ugreen. I have been playing around with this. I found this really easy, much easier than I expected. And I'm going to do a dedicated video to that type of storage. But the primary difference is the devices we're going to talk about today, hard disk drives and solid state drives, are attached directly to your computer. We're going to talk about the types of attachments and why that matters in just a minute. And I am going to give you some tips on how to organize that and maybe improve your workflow. There's also cloud-based storage. That's a third type of storage. And in this video, we're going to mention it. I'm not going to do a dedicated video on it. I've always viewed cloud storage more as a backup. So when we talk about types of storage, we are going to mention backups. I'll mention how I back my files up, and that will be a cloud-based system. But to jump right in here, we're going to talk about the two primary types of drives, and that's the hard disk drive, what it's best at and what it should be used for, and the solid state drive, what it's best at and what it should be used for. So the first device we're going to talk about is a hard disk drive, or HDD. I'm actually got one here in my hand, so I'm going to show you this. This is one of my older hard disk drives, and this one is measured in terabytes. This is 4 terabytes of information. And to give you an idea of what a terabyte can hold, I'm going to put some numbers over here on the side. It gives you a very general idea. When you've got video, you're taking up a lot more storage. I'm going to just put some basic information around images and how much you can expect to store per terabyte. Now, like many of you, you started off with one type of storage device and you realized it wasn't enough. This is probably a decade old, and I think it was 4 terabytes on this hard drive. And this is what I originally used. At some point, I realized that I needed 8. And then I realized I needed more, and I'm now up to 14 terabytes. And I've got about 10 terabytes of that information just dedicated to photos and videos. So quite a bit of images stored on that device. Now, a hard disk device like this HDD, this is going to be a physical process, meaning this is going to spin like a record player. It's just going to spin a lot faster, probably about 100 times faster than your record player spins at home. This is, because it's a physical device, has some disadvantages, but it also has some huge advantages. Now, in contrast, I'm going to show you an SSD, or a solid state drive. Now, this is a small 4 terabyte SSD drive. Now, some people might ask, do I have a recommendation? I can only tell you the ones I use. This isn't a review on products, but I've had pretty good luck with Samsung. So I'll put a listing down below to this one. This one I use for travel. And one of the basic differences is this has no moving parts. Therefore, I can shake it and rattle it, and it's going to still store that memory the same way. If there was a large impact for some reason, this device is probably not going to handle that as well. So when you see travel devices, they are almost always going to be solid state devices. Now, over on the side, I'm going to put some pros and cons of each of these and let you know what their best uses are. So when it comes to an HDD, you're talking about something that's going to be a little bit cheaper, well, significantly cheaper per terabyte, but it is going to be slower. It's going to be better for archiving. So think of HDD or hard disk drive. Think of this as your long-term storage. It does have the moving parts, which makes it more fragile. So something that you're setting up at home permanently has a lot of advantages, and most of those advantages come in the form of price. I'll give you an idea of those prices in just a minute, what you can expect for maybe a 10 or 16 terabyte hard drive versus a solid state drive. Now, I had mentioned earlier, too, that some people are using these for your permanent storage. I would definitely not recommend this. These are your most fragile types of storage. One, physically, they can get crushed or mauled. You can lose them very easily, and they are extremely expensive. To give you an idea about these 4 terabytes, this one you can get probably for $100 right now, and for 4 terabytes. Something like this for 4 terabytes, expect to pay a couple $100. Something like this for 4 terabytes, you might be a couple $1,000, because this storage is the most expensive of those 3 formats. So when it comes to HDD drives, what you're primarily thinking of this as long-term storage. Think of this as like your file cabinet at work. It's going to be slower to get to, but the stuff you really don't deal with often, go put it in a file cabinet over there. And when you need it once a month or once a year, you just go over to the file cabinet, open it, and grab it. But most of us in a work situation or a planning situation, you may have a daily notebook or a to-do list. Now, you would never want to put your to-do list in the filing cabinet. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. Every time you want to grab something, you got to go to the filing cabinet, because we want something that's fast and accessible. And that's where SSD drives come into play. So these SSD drives, while much more expensive for the same amount of information to be stored, they are significantly faster. Now, I'm going to put over here some of those speeds, and it's important to note this is only one part of speed. We're going to talk about the second and sometimes the more important part, which is how you connect it, in just a minute. But I'll put some of these ideas around speed over here, and it gives you an idea of what a hard disk drive is capable of in terms of speed and what a solid state drive is capable in terms of speed. The fact that there are no moving parts, again, these are much better for travel. Now, in my personal system, I'm going to show you in a minute. I'm going to actually pull up my folders here and show you what my computer looks like. And I'm not saying that this is right for everybody or to model yours after mine, but I will tell you my thought process. And I am not a computer scientist. I did not go to school for this, but over the years, I have tried to accumulate a lot of information around this and just make it work for me. So my system may not work for you. If you are an expert in this subject, feel free to let me know down in the comments, and I will pin your comment to the top so others can jump in. Now let's talk about just the ways to store these hard disk drives. So primarily, you're going to have two ways to integrate it into your system. You could wire it directly into the computer, and there's two types of internal connections in your computer. One is an SATA or SATA, and the other is an NVMe. And if I make any mistakes, I'll correct it over here on the side. If you've watched my videos, sometimes I get a little tongue-tied when I do this. If you are connecting it with an external connection, there's a couple things that are critical. And one is understanding the port that you are using. So for example, if I know what this drive is capable of, and I mentioned it's a little slower, I may not want to utilize the fastest port on my computer for the slowest storage device that I have. However, if I know that this is faster, I would want to make sure this device is connected, if I'm using it externally, to the fastest connection on my computer. Now inside, I mentioned there's two types of storage. Outside or external connections, we have quite a few. Now when we talk about these external connections, it is very important to understand the type of connections that we have. So I'm going to explain a few of them here, and I will again use these graphics to help us out here. You're going to have USB 2.0. That's your slowest connection. We really want to avoid that one if we can. If you've got an older computer and that is an option, and it's one of the only options you have, that's the one you're going to want to hook up to your long-term storage. We also have USB 3 and USB 3.2. There's also USB-C. That's a different type of connection. That's not a speed, that's a type of connection, so you have to also understand the speed of yours. And then we also have Thunderbolt connections, and this is probably the fastest available connection on your computer. Again, I'm going to list over here some of those types of connections, and I'm going to include in this list the SATA or the SATA and the NVMe connections. Your fastest connections are going to be that NVMe. I'm going to talk about that one because if you are, this is something I learned, by the way, just a few years ago, how much faster that connection is, and I never took advantage of it. If you take nothing else out of this video, even if you're advanced or pretty intermediate in some of this, this may be a tip that helps you out quite a bit. I'm going to list those speeds over here. And again, think about when matching up the device to the speed that you know where those are. As a pro tip, there's some software out there that can identify all of your USB ports. So if you're not sure what they are, I'll put the software over on the side here. And I've used this quite a bit. It's called USB Tree View. And I have found this to be very, very helpful when I was configuring my computer here, so that you know my computer has about 10 USB connections. I've got monitors, I've got software, I've got sound, I've got all sorts of things running through one computer. So it was really important for me to understand what needed the fastest connections and where could I get away with slower connections. As a general tip though, your long-term storage should be on your slower connections if that's all you have, but make sure your SSD is on your faster connections. Now, not all connections are external. I mentioned there are some internals. I'm going to pull up my drive here. And this is literally my computer. And on this, you're going to see a couple things that are flagged. So the first drive is going to be called OSC. That's a hard disk drive. Some computers, that may be a solid state drive. For me, it's an HDD drive. That is only where my programs are. I don't put any storage in that drive, and I would encourage you, if you currently are storing onto the number one or the only hard drive you have, come up with another system. You go down and you look at a drive called backup 8 terabyte. That's the original 8 terabyte drive that I had years ago. That's got all my old photos on it. I still have it connected to this computer because I had a port available. That's on my slowest available port. I've got another one that says main drive 14 terabyte. That's where all of my good stuff is. That's where every photo I've ever taken, besides the ones I'm currently editing, but all the old photos live on that drive. I'm not going to get into how I organize that. Everybody's going to have their own way, but you can do that by date or species. But I would highly recommend, if you do nothing else, don't be like one of the clients I mentioned earlier and just take a folder and throw it into somewhere. Make sure the folder has some kind of naming methodology. So for me, I put, year, date, month, and that helps me out a lot. This next drive, I want to talk about these three. You're going to see 3 SSD drives, and this is critical, and this is a big point of emphasis for this video. The first SSD drive, I call this my working drive, and this is connected by SATA, S-A-T-A. This SATA connection is limited in speed. It's not the fastest connection I have, but I use this because it's faster as an SSD drive than working off of one of my externals. So when I come home from a shoot, a lot of my images will just start here, but I have one other drive I want to show you first, and that's called this 2 terabyte scratch drive. Now this I use for 2 functions, and I'm going to give you a pro tip on this in just a minute. But when I come home from a shoot, the first thing I do is I download the images onto this drive. And why this drive? This is my fastest drive. This one is connected to an NVMe slot in my computer. Now these look a little different, and it does require you, in my case at least, to insert the SSD drive directly into the motherboard into that slot. That connection though is about 4 or 5 times faster than my other connections. So this is the fastest drive I have. So what do I use this drive for? Knowing that this is my blazing speed, this is where I cull all of my images. So if I had the ability, and I strongly recommend your fastest drive be used to cull and or edit from directly. Because I typically am working on 10 or 15 files at a time, once I cull it and I make a first run through, I will send it from this scratch drive into this 1 terabyte drive where I just kind of edit from. I mentioned there's going to be a couple of pro tips in here as well, and this is a big one. You may be using some editing software that is really consuming memory, and it wants fast memory. And if it doesn't have that, it can bog your whole system down. I don't know if you've ever opened Photoshop and you've been working for a while and you maybe open a couple versions and you haven't closed it down and you import some more and you start working and working. All of a sudden, the system starts to get really slow. And Photoshop or Lightroom might become so slow that it's like, you know what, I got to close the whole program down and reopen it. Often that's because a lack of memory in the computer. But if you want to improve your editing speed, think about having what I've labeled this one as a scratch drive. You can notice it's 2 terabytes. It holds a lot of information, but that is blazing fast for me. And that's where I have my Photoshop scratch files set to. Now you can do that in Photoshop. I run a Patreon channel. It's a subscription channel. I'm going to talk about and show that in a video over there on how to do that. I'm not going to take the time on YouTube to do that, but I will tell you as a tip here, I would strongly encourage you to think about taking advantage of that NVMe drive. I'm amazed how many people I say, have you ever used that drive? I think 80% of the casual photographers have never thought about using that as a drive slot. So if your computer has that, and I'm a Windows-based photographer, but if your computer has that available, think about that. Now, there are some other really fast connections out there. So if you've got a Thunderbolt connection, you will probably want to use that. But some computers are just limited on how many slots they have available. So when you think about this idea of speed and efficiency and organization, really just break it down into some common sense logic. Make sure your slowest devices aren't on your fastest ports. It's kind of like putting a bicycle on the Autobahn. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But probably more importantly, make sure your fastest devices, your fastest capable devices, your SSD drives are connected to the fastest possible port on your computer. That way you're maximizing this speed. And when you're doing these transfers back and forth, it can make a pretty significant difference. There is one other thing we didn't talk about, and that's cables themselves. Not every cable is created equally, and I have found this out. I was on a trip one time and I grabbed a storage cable and I thought I grabbed kind of the standard cable and I grabbed the wrong one. I went to start uploading these photos into a little card reader and it actually wouldn't even recognize it because the cable wasn't rated for what I needed. So I had to go find another cable, and fortunately I had one. But it was interesting to note that the device, I thought the device had broken, but as soon as I changed the cables, it worked again, and it was because the cable wasn't rated. It didn't have the speed rating to handle that device. So it is very, very important that you understand that there's a bottleneck, and whatever the slowest part of that bottleneck is, that's where you're going to be throttled to. So sometimes it is that cable. So if I could give you some advice on this around a workflow and what makes sense, this is what I think most kind of hobby photographers should have. You should have an editing drive, and that should probably be an SSD drive that is either on a fast connection or connected internally. And if you have an NVMe drive slot available, I would recommend that. And that would be option for a hobbyist. This is probably the main point that people miss. A lot of people are doing all of their editing off of one drive, and sometimes that's a hard drive. It's just going to slow you down. If you've got the budget and you can do one SSD drive connected to your fastest connection available, and then one external hard drive that is much bigger than you think you need, because in 3 or 4 years, you're probably going to be going through this process again. I would also recommend, and we're not spending a lot of time in this video on this, but I can do some videos around backup. I would also recommend, once you're serious and you don't want to lose those files, you have a system of offline backup or cloud backup. Now, I use a service called Backblaze. This is not sponsored. I'm not paid for this. But that is a service I've been using probably for about 7 years, and it's fairly affordable, and it's just an emergency. If that hard drive on the floor down there breaks, I can go and retrieve all of my files. It's updated every night overnight. It just looks for new files and it updates itself. I never even notice it's running, and it runs in the background quietly. And I would strongly encourage you to do that. I'll put some links down there. Again, some of this is going to be products that I've just used and I like. None of this part of this video is paid or sponsored. I did get an NAS drive that I'm really excited to talk to you about. And again, that one came from a company called Ugreen. I'm going to go into all of that in another video. I was going to force it all into one video, but I thought, let's take our time and do it right. If you can improve this editing workflow, probably what I would look at is definitely that fast NVMe connection editing drive that is also doubling as a scratch drive for your editing. I'm not going to do a video on this channel for that, but if you want to follow me over on Patreon, I will be making a video on that. You're also going to want a dedicated external SSD drive for the field, so you have something to download. I do that through a laptop. There are, by the way, some drives that you can download directly to. I have not used those in the past. I might get my hands on one in the future and try it out, and I'll give you a scouting report or some feedback on that. And then you may be looking, if you're more advanced, you may be looking at that dedicated HDD archive drive, as well as an NAS system and or cloud backup. It's just important to understand that NAS is a dedicated system that can be used for a lot of different things, including dedicated backup. But because it's a little bit more advanced, I'm going to do a separate video on that. So that's my video on storage. There's one other thing when we're talking about backup I just want to mention, and it's this idea of the 3-2-1 rule. And the 3-2-1 rule just basically states that anytime you're worried about information, you should have 3 copies of it. You should have 2 different storage types, and one site should be stored somewhere else. That idea of storing something somewhere else is really avoiding catastrophic damage. So if you had a fire or a flood or a power surge or something happened at your house and everything at your home was destroyed, even if you had it backed up. So I showed you on my listing, I had 2 hard drives. One was listed as a backup. Even if I had backed one hard drive up to another hard drive, that saves me only if there's a hard drive failure. It does not save me if there's a fire or one of my dogs runs in here and decides to eat both hard drives. So just know that that 321 is a very common term or a very common phrase for storage, and we'll deal with that a little bit more in the next video. Let me know down in the comments what questions you have and what did you find helpful about this. I would really encourage you to deep dive your system. Just take an hour, grab an adult beverage or a cup of coffee, and use some of the tools available and try to figure out, where am I putting these folders, these images, and does it make sense? And is there a more efficient way? Am I taking advantage of the fastest type of storage for editing? And am I taking advantage of the most cost-effective storage for archiving and long-term storage? And I showed you my setup. Maybe that helped you. Maybe you have some questions about that. I'm happy to answer them for you down in the comments. In the next video, we're going to talk about that NAS storage. NAS, again, that's a network system. It does have both hard disk drives and or solid state drives. The difference being it's not directly attached to the computer through a cable, although you can, and we'll talk about that in the next video. Thanks for tuning into this one. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. I do a lot of different reviews. I do some opinion pieces around wildlife photography. I do some educational things. Every once in a while, I delve into gear in something like this, software or a more technical thing. But it's all done with this idea of being practical and trying to make a difference, not over-explaining things, keeping it very simple and basic. So I hope you like the approach. If you do, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. That'll let you know when I have a new video out. And hit that like button. That'll push the content out to other people. If you know somebody struggling with storage, I want you to hit the share button down below. It's down there somewhere. And I want you to share this video, copy the link, and send it to your friend, because you know you've got a friend that has got everything stored on these or is sticking these in a basket like one of my clients. I know you know somebody that's doing it. Send them this video. Maybe it can help them out a little bit. Thanks for tuning in today. And as always, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.